there's like a demon in that computer program, and every once in a while the words, even though the font is white, it'll just turn black. I don't know why, it just does. So there's that. But before we get started, you need to turn to one of the persons beside you. Presumably there's only two. One, maybe, if you're on the end. And just say, honey, I love you, and you're going to smile, okay? Say, honey, I love you, and I just have to smile. Say it. Go.
Honey, I love you, just have to
Turn to someone
smile.
on your side. It doesn't matter which. Honey, I love you, and I just have to smile.
Honey, I love
All right, now turn the other way and say the same thing. So if someone got left out, they're left out.
I'm still not going to smile.
Welcome. Glad you're here. How many here has seen the movie or have seen the movie Amistad?
What is Amistad? I don't know.
Good, because it's rated R, so you shouldn't see it. Actually, it's not bad. It's actually a very, very good movie, but just it's about a very, very horrible time in our nation's history and a horrible occurrence that happened during that time. And it's just very, it's very graphic in what it shows. But basically, it's a story about a slave ship called the Amistad that is basically, they would cart traffic in slaves and selling and buying slaves in the early 1800s. And this particular ship, on one of their routes or whatever, they were overtaken by the prisoners, and they were trying to find their way back to Africa, but they'd never sailed a ship before, so they kind of got lost, and they basically get overtaken by the Coast Guard or whoever. I don't know if they had the Coast Guard, but whoever the authorities were, whatever. They take them and they bring them in, and they're on trial. Because they killed all the crew, so they're the bad guys, that they killed the crew that had enslaved them, so go figure. And it's kind of, what do we do with this situation here? And because they were claiming that they were legally purchased or something like that, and not that they were ripped out of their homes in Africa, which is in fact what had happened. And so it's this whole court trial trying to figure this out. It's a true story. And it's got some pretty big name actors and actresses in it, by the way. Morgan Freeman's in there, Matthew McConaughey's in there. All you ladies would be happy for that, I'm sure. Who else is in there? Matthew McConaughey's in there. There's a bunch of others. Anyway, here's the thing. The night before the final day of the trial, the main slave who had the main captive, who is kind of the spokesperson for the rest, his name was Sinkay. And he had actually been a king in his own land. And you see the main lawyer, who is John Quincy Adams. He was a president at one point. This is after his presidency. He's representing this guy, or all of them, and he's talking to him. And Sinkay is very calm, very at ease. And he says, what's going on? And he says, whereas up to this point, Sinkay's been very distraught. And basically he says, I have consulted my ancestors, and they have shown me what I should do. And he doesn't really go into detail what that is, but he just, basically you get this picture that Sinkay has drawn strength and wisdom from his ancestors, from the ones who have gone before him, and that has given him the courage and the wisdom to face the situation that will happen the next day, whatever that may be. And John Quincy Adams takes his cue from that, and the next day you see him in his speech before the Supreme Court, and basically he tells them that story. And then he said, so I learned something from Sinkay, so I thought that we should do the same. And basically what he does is he says, let's look back to our forefathers, and let's look back to what they said about humanity and the way we should regard human beings of any race, of any creed, of any type, of any religion. Let's look back and see what they said was true of the way we regard humanity. Never mind the fact that some of them didn't necessarily always follow those practices, but let's look back at what they said, and let's let what happened in the past inform the way we should make decisions for the present. And in fact, that speech that he gave, I think that they don't show this in the movie, but I think in the history books, the speech went on for hours and hours and maybe days, and I think that's where they came up with the law that you can't like, what's the law where you can't like stymie the court or whatnot? I don't know, you have a time limit. He was the one it was this trial that did it, because John Quincy Adams just went on and on and on and on. But anyway, they don't show that in the movie, but he tells them that story, and he gets them to think back to what their forefathers intended for the way they should regard humans. And that gave them the wisdom, and that gave them the strength to deal with the situation at hand. My dad, all his life, his adult life, most of his adult life, I guess I should say, was kind of into finance. I mean, that was his background. That's not what he went to school for. He was into Southeast Asian history when he went to school. Why? I don't know. That's just my dad. He was kind of a nerd. The only time he really taught anything about Southeast Asian history was when he lived in Southeast Asia. Go figure. But most of the time, other than that, when he was in the States, his background was in finance. He was a money guy, numbers guy. That's what he did. And when we lived in Pennsylvania, he worked with his uncle at his garden center. Like if you go places to buy flowers and stuff like that, that's where they had their own business. So anyway, and he did the finances for that, and helped them figure out what to do with their money and all that. And for a while, he worked for the township, and that was his thing. But when he was 39 years old, my mom was 38, 39, about the same, they felt like God was leading them to make a change. They didn't know what it was. And it turned out where God was leading them, which is not what they wanted to do, but where God was leading them was to move to Kentucky, and to southeastern Kentucky, in the hills of Kentucky, in the town of Beverly, the Beverly Hillbillies. And move there and work at the Red River Mission, which is the United Methodist Mission, and kind of put his financial skills to work there. And that's what he did. And like I said, he didn't really want to do that. That wasn't like when he was saying, God, I know you're leading me to do something. He didn't initially say, I'll do anything you want. He didn't really want to leave Pennsylvania. That was our home. That's where we lived at that point for 12 years. Loved our church. We had a lot of family there. My dad's uncle and all his kids and their families were there. My dad's brother was there and their family. So I grew up with my cousins when we lived there. And he didn't really want to uproot his family and go to a strange place. But it turns out that's what God had him do. And I still remember, even though he wasn't really a preacher, because he worked at the River Mission and he was technically a missionary, and there were people sending money to help pay his salary. Periodically, he would go to churches and speak about the Red River Mission, and oftentimes he would go in October. He'd go to his supporting churches, and he would tell them what he was doing, and he'd tell them about the ministry that was happening at Redbird. And sometimes he would take one of his kids with him, just kind of some fun times, father-son time, daughter-father time. There we go. It was just a good time. I mean, my favorite memories were there was waking up at midnight when we were traveling, and we'd get hot dogs 2 for $1 at the gas station. Those were good times. Good times. So anyway, you can really make yourself sick doing that. But that's what I always look forward to. And I learned to juggle on one of those trips. It was great. So, but on those, I would hear him preach, and he basically had 3 sermons that he preached over and over again for 15, 17 years, something like that. Heard him do that time and time and time again. And so you just kind of, if you can imagine hearing the same sermon over and over again, you just get to where it's kind of emblazoned in your brain. And one of the sermons he would give over and over again was on the life of Abraham. And if you know the story of Abraham, basically when Abraham was 75 years old, kind of late in years, he had a wife, he had a household, he didn't have kids at that point, but he had a successful business, he had a successful household, and in the land of his father, and everything's going well for him. About that time, God